Welcome, everyone. This is our Friday webinar, and today we're going to be talking about creating panel graphs in DataGraph. This is a topic that I was interested in doing partly because we've heard feedback from a number of users that this was a key feature they felt in the program that for some people was one of the reasons they decided to try DataGraph, because they saw that this was an option for them to create these. And they're so prevalent. I think when I advertised this webinar, I mentioned how you can't pick up any scientific journal without seeing some panel graphs. So just to show you the type of graphics that I'm referring to, I picked up my copy of Science that I had lying around, and sure enough, the first page that I opened up had this graphic here, which is showing you a number of different graphs across, each panel is showing some different data, and there's a shared axis on one side. So this is a type of graphic that you can definitely make something like this in DataGraph. This is really sort of an interesting one. They have multiple types of graphs going on, but you could certainly do this. The other thing that I did this week to, I guess, kind of have a little bit of inspiration for what we would talk about today, I was looking at my copy of Tufte's The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. And he has a number of examples in here that are sort of interesting, and also refers to these graphs that are called, he calls them small multiples, where you have many graphics that are tiny, because often you don't necessarily have to have the graph be large in order to convey certain information. Here's one with images showing kind of a time, an elapsed phenomena. You can bring images into DataGraph, so you could compose something like this. We're not quite going to talk about that specifically today, but there's a number of other examples here, like the one you see here, where there's a shared x-axis. That's the sort of thing that you can certainly create. And there's another one here, again, in particular, this idea of small multiples, that you can have many graphs that they don't necessarily have to be big. You can convey a lot of information in a small place. And the examples that we're going to do to start with today are going to be pretty basic, because I want to make sure that you understand really the fundamental ways that you can control these graphics and to make these more complicated things, as I just showed you. What you're seeing here is an example of a panel graph within DataGraph. This is a basic example that we will start out with. I'll show you how to create this, and also talk about adding labels and how that's slightly different once you start to create panel graphs, and other commands that can traverse across multiple axes. The other examples we'll talk about, well, I wasn't necessarily going to pop this one up right away, but this is an example of a scatter plot matrix that I created using some meteorological data. So I'll share with you this data set and show you where you can get this, and we'll show you how you could do something like this. And I guess I might as well click on here. This is a much larger scatter plot matrix. This is a 10 by 10. Notice this has, there's no gap in between the boxes, but each one of these is an individual axis within DataGraph that has a command drawing into it. So, this may, if you've never done these before, this might look, oh, this would be sort of tedious to create, but because of the way that you can clone groups of commands and the way that I have this set up, actually, this did not take me that long to construct this as an overall template file to work on. Another example of a type of a panel graph that I want to show you how to do is something like you see here, where I was just sort of playing around with this a little bit, so I don't have axis labels on all of this. But here you have individual graphs that have a category associated with them. So I have different years for each one of these graphics. And again, there's a shared axis on the left-hand side. So, okay. So for those of you who are following along with DataGraph, then the files that we're going to start with will be actually coming from the online examples. And here we go. So so if you go to your online examples and just type in panel, then you should see the 4 graphs that I have here. I actually just updated the 2 at the bottom to add a little bit more explanation for our webinar today, but we're going to start with this one, just this basic panel graph. So you can go ahead and open that file. And again, this is, I think, basically what we were looking at, but I just want us to start at the same place. And what you see here is I have one X and one Y and a second X and Y. The first lesson is just, in case you haven't done this before, when you open this file, you'll see, click the split X and Y buttons to create the panels. And this is very easy to do. I actually wanted to also just do this in a brand new file so that you could see what this looked like. So if you want to do that as well, I'm going to make a new file. And when you have any graph like this, if you click on the canvas setting, split X and split Y, the graph itself may not look that different to you right now, although there are now these gaps that you'll see here in between on the axis. Let me expand this out. But what happened is I added these 2 objects to my list, and these are similar to the way we have this object that represents the axis settings. These objects that are created when I make the split axis represent that axis as well. The default that DataGraph has is to only outline make one outline around the entire figure. But for creating graphs like this, it's typically very useful to see the boxes. And this is an option that's underneath the style settings. If you open up your style settings, you'll see box style. And again, it's set to 1 box. So I can change this to be axis box. And now you see the outlines around everything. Another way to do the same thing is actually just to right click or otherwise known as control click on the graph itself. And you'll see that there's a box style option there. I just changed it to axis box. But if you want it to go back to 1 box, there's other box styles here, offset axis or only axis. But again, axis box is usually the one that I use when I'm creating these graphs so that you can see each individual one. So let's go ahead and go back to the one that you see here. This one is already set up with the style for the axis box. So when I create a brand new graph, if I split X and split Y again, it's using the same settings from the first graph that's there. Hopefully that makes sense. But so now I have my split axes. I have the objects that represent each of those, and I can now add commands and place them in one of these 4 locations. So if I just mimic, for example, the one that we have here, and I create a line plot for X1 versus Y1, for example, I might want to then add axis labels here. So the default when you're using these panel graphs is the bottom left is always going to be the main axis. So that's an important thing to remember as you're kind of moving things around and creating these. The bottom left is always the main axis. As a result, if I type in X1 and Y1 into my main canvas setting, the titles, you'll see that in this bottom left-hand axis. So to create another plot within this, now I want to do, say, X1 versus Y2, and I'm going to put that in another location. I can click on this graphic, and as many of you have heard me say, I love the option drag approach. So click on it, hold the option key down, that makes a clone, and then I can change this one to Y2. And over on the right-hand side now of each of my commands, you'll see that there is a little image that mimics the format of my overall graphic, and I can just click to place the graph here, and you'll notice how again, these are sharing the y-axis, so it doesn't repeat the labels on the y-axis for these other graphics because they're the same as what you see here. And that is the preferred approach. For example, if you read in Science Magazine, what are the style guidelines that they have for creating graphs? They recommend that when you have individual panels that share an axis, that you don't repeat them. So that is the way that we do this here. Okay, so now I want to make two more that do the same thing. So I can actually highlight both graphs, hold my option key, click and drag. Now I have 4 commands, and I want to change the 2 that I just created to using X2 instead of X1. And I'm going to move these to the panels above. I click on a line, and then it's highlighting for me the command in my list that's corresponding to that line within my graph. The same thing here. So this makes it really very handy to navigate where commands are. In fact, this is not just for creating panel graphs, but anytime that you are creating a graphic that has multiple commands, this is a way for you to go between the graph and the command list. Anyway, so I guess the one thing I will tell you is that if you have the commands nested within a group, so let me just illustrate this. I put all my commands in this group. Now it will still go between the commands, but if I close the group, it's not going to expand the group out for you. And that's really kind of a design choice, to not have it always opening and closing the groups if you have multiple groups. So you do have to have the group open if you have them closed, but then you can navigate between them. Okay. So that was maybe a happy accident, because that is a good thing to share with you in terms of how you can navigate that. And I don't necessarily need these in groups, so I'll just remove that. So a couple of other basic things that I want to make sure you're aware of. One of them is that, well, what if you changed your mind and you decided you wanted all of these on the same graph? Then all you have to do is highlight the object that represents that split axis. So here, for example, I can highlight my second y-axis and click delete, and now the commands shifted down because I took away that y-axis. So now the split x still exists, but I could also just click the object that represents the split axis for the x and hit delete. And now everything is on the same axis. Now there's just one axis there. Let me undo that, because the other thing that I want to show you is that the commands themselves for the split axis are things that they are, again, objects, but like many other things that you work with within DataGraph. They are not objects that you can click and drag around. So similar to the style settings and the canvas settings and your axis settings, these are pinned to a location. However, you can copy them to make more of them, like you can with your commands. So if I do my option drag technique with this split x-axis, look what happens. I end up with now a whole bunch of split x-axis and x-axes, and I can do the same thing with my y-axis. So that is a really handy kind of a trick to realize. It's actually something that I didn't know for quite a while, that those were things that I could copy and paste. Because, say, for example, I wanted to have my, let me actually, I'll delete these here and show this to you. Say I didn't want any space in between the panels as I created them. That's a setting that's within the split axis object. So I can expand this open, and for the x-axis, you'll see that there is a space on left option here, and it's set to medium. You can change this to very wide or small, or you can change it to nothing. You also can change it to an exact amount that you could change the pixel size for. One advantage of doing that is that then you could use a variable to control this. So I might as well just show you how to do this now, because this is kind of a handy thing to be aware of too. So if I said, this is my, I'll just call this space, and we'll make this, I don't know, 0 to maybe 50 pixels. So now I have a variable that I can control, and I could put into the location here. So again, that would control the space in between these from 0 to whatever I wanted it to be. Then if I'm going ahead and making multiple axes, multiple split axes, I can just start with the one that has the setting the way I like it, and go ahead and again, just option drag this to create multiple. And now when I use my slider, now I can control for all of these at the same time, the space in between. And if you've already created them, you can, go back in and change it to use the variable, but that would be, a little bit more tedious. It's great if you have the, if you're going to make a lot of them, then you can set some of these things to variables to allow you to easily share. Using a global variable like this is a great way to do that. A couple of other basic things that I wanted to show you. First of all, as you can see now, maybe I'll remove a couple of these, just make it a little smaller. So now I have these panels that are places where I can put my commands into, and can, move my commands around between these different panels. There are 2 commands that can actually traverse across multiple graphs within your overall figure. And the first one that I'll show you is the range command. So if you click on the range command, then you automatically have a highlighted range. By default, this is going from 0 to 1, and it's on the y-axis, it specifically says everything. If you wanted to change that to a specific interval, like here, changing y to interval changes now y from 0 to 1, it's now no longer going to go across multiple axes. So what you can't do is you can't say, I want it to go up to y equals to 4 on the above axis. It's either, you kind of have an either or option. You can have it go through all of the y-axis axes, or you can set some kind of an interval where you can have it go, to a specific location on the axis you see here. And one subtle thing to notice that when you change that, so let me bring this back to everything. And now if you look over at the tiles, you'll notice that the tile for the top axis is a slightly darker gray than the axis that's the command is started in, the main axis, that bottom left. So this is a visual indicator that this is crossing multiple y-axes. And you could do the same thing if you want to, change this to have X be everything. Now it's going to move across all three of these X axes also. And I could make this an interval, and then it's only going to go across here. So I could have 1 to 2 and highlight some range of either X or Y. The other command that I wanted to show you that will go across is the lines command. Now, the lines command is somewhat opposite, delete that one, of the range command, in that by default, it's only going to be on one axis. So I can just type in, for example, let's just do 0.5. And let me change this to something with a little color and make this a little thicker so you can see this line. So here again, you can see from the tiles, this is only on that bottom. Clearly the data is showing you that as well. But if I expand this out, then the command has an option for extent that by default says this axis. If you want to change that and have it go across all of the y-axes, then you can just have it set to all axis. And I'm trying to think of what else to say there. So now, if I say 2 or 3 or 4, it's going to stay in that x-axis, but it will go across all the y's. If you wanted another lines command to go into the next x-axis, then we would make a copy of that and put it over there. And there's a different X range, so that looks different. But you would need to have an individual one for each axis. Another thing that you can do here is you have the option of whether or not the lines command is included in the range of the data. This is kind of a handy thing, just again, to be aware of. Maybe not for this case, but just in general. So right now I typed in, for example, the number 4 as one of the places where I wanted to place an X line. That's beyond the range of the data being plotted. So it changed my X-axis range down below here. If I say exclude from range, now I no longer see that line because it's not being considered in terms of the extent of the x-axis. Okay, so I think those were the main things that I wanted to actually there was one other basic thing that I wanted to make sure that you knew how to do, and that is the ability to, let me go ahead and delete these, played with those a little bit, the ability to change the location of the x-axis. Sorry if that's not quite making sense. Let me try and be clear. The labeling of the x-axis. So let me see. Okay, so there's one question online. Thanks for asking a question. Can you prevent the line from appearing in the gap between the panels? So if I have this line, this is a great question. If I do all axes and I make this red, what about if I don't want to show it in the space in between the axes? And there is not a, oops, sorry, there's not a setting to just not draw that. But what you can do is just clone this command and have this one just stay in its own axis. And, or actually, I probably didn't want to clone the one that was like that. Have one command where it goes across this axis, another command where it goes across the other axis. And then now, of course, so now you do see that gap, but if you wanted to change this number, you would have to change it in both locations. So the solution to that would be well, you could do it a couple of different ways. You can use a variable. So if I just wanted to have a single line, but I wanted to, control where that line was located across both places together, then I could make that a variable and be able to control it. You can also have the input for the lines command coming from the data, coming from a column itself. So here, for example, if I wanted both of or each location where I had an X1, I can choose that column as where I would have the lines. Anyway, so I hope that helps to answer your question. What if I want a line between the graphs? How I would do this is to do yet another split. So have another split axis where the two that are on the middle, so this one's currently in the middle and this one's in the middle, right? If you look at where the tiles are, I can place, I don't think I've shown you this yet. So another technique that I want to show you in general is how to move multiple commands between axes. So I can place these in a group. And this would be, let's see, I want this at the top. And then move this to y-axis 3. So do you see how I changed I clicked the gear menu on the group and I said, move this to axis 3 to move both of those at the same time. That's just an easier way to do it. Now my center one here, actually, I guess with this box style, this isn't quite going to do what I want to do. You would be able to, like this, right? You could, now you have this axis in between, and I could do a lines command that I put in that middle axis, and I make that a Y line, and I have that extending across all axes, for example. So the other trick here to be aware of, so I don't know if this is exactly doing what you're interested in, but right now I still have an equal separation between each of my Y axes. And to make this really work properly, you would want the middle to be much, much narrower. And you can control that by going to this, let's see, sorry, you could see, again, looking at the icons on the right-hand side, this is my middle Y-axis. If I open this up, there is an option for height, and this is a height relative to all of the other axes. So if I want this middle space to be very narrow, then I can just change this height to being very narrow. Go to the the file that I have, where I have the, let's see. Actually, what I wanted to do, sorry, what I want you to do is to open up the next one that's in the example file, the scatter plot matrix. There we go. So this is a very similar to the one that we had before, except now I have a 3x3, and you can see I have X and Y data here. I have the same thing. There's just more commands, and these are all listed here. So what I want to do is I want to now change the data that we're using for this. And the data that we're going to use, I will post this link on the chat. Okay, so this is meteorological data from Heathrow Airport. And this is a data set that runs from 1948 down to, go all the way down here, down to current day data. Some of the more recent data is provisional. This is kind of a nice data set. I've used this for things like this before. So if you want to bring this in to DataGraph, one kind of quick approach is just to use Command A to select everything, Command C to copy the data, and then I'm going to go into this file and I want to paste it in, but I want to paste it in its own location. So what I often do with these templates is I will take the columns that exist there already, and before I paste this in, I'm going to place these in a group. So I highlighted all those columns, put this in a group. Ooh, there we go. So this is my original data. Then I can unhide that from view. And now I can just paste, oops, that's not where I meant to paste that. There we go, paste this into the data table. And you see a couple of different things here. Let's see. I'm going to get my bearings here a little bit. So the row that you see, so DataGraph did interpret the columns of data that we have here. There's a lot of text up above that we don't need. One handy trick if you're bringing in data like this, and there's a lot of text above that maybe you don't need for plotting, but you kind of want to just keep around for documentation, you can highlight these rows and copy them. So say Command C, then use the text box. So I'm going to add a comment block into my data list, and then paste the data that I copied from here into that comment block. So I don't know, I do that a lot. I'm always afraid of deleting something I might need. So then it just keeps that data around. But in terms of the actual, my table here, I definitely do not need all of those rows. This is just asking me to check, where do you want to delete all the columns, including the hidden columns? No, I want to only delete the visible data that's on my data table. So I'll click that. Now it did bring in a whole bunch of columns that got created that I don't need. And so I'm going to just select all of these. I mean, I could select them here in the data table too, but select all of those objects and hit the delete key. Now I only have columns for the data that I've imported. There are, there's some missing data here. That's fine. You don't need to worry about that. We can use the data that is there. This row that starts with Y, this is a row that I want to use as my column header. So I'm going to right click and say use row for column titles. And then I can just, I guess well, now see the way that these labels came in, these actually are not the labels for that particular data. So I think I'll just delete the units there for now. Okay, so again, I'm deleting only the visible rows of data. So now I have this data set that I will place in its own group. And I want to put that data into the data set you see here. And there's a couple of different things that a couple of different ways that you could possibly do it. Now, certainly one way would be just to take one of my columns of data here. If I wanted to plot, actually I'll do my year versus the maximum temperature. If I wanted to put that into one of these locations, I could paste that in. Now, that's not quite what I want to do. So what I really want to do, so you can paste data in and, oh, actually, you know what? There's one more thing I did not do here that I need to show you, because that did not quite do what we wanted to do, did it? Notice that these are still text data. So there's a little AB that indicates that. So because there was all of those headers, when I pasted the data in, it got pasted in as text, but that's very easy to fix. I can highlight all these columns at once. And then if you use this gear menu that's on the data table, click that, and then select change to a number column. Now these are all numerical values. So now if I take, actually we'll just do month versus the maximum temperature, paste that into the original data location, and then that overwrites the data just for these two, for that location, and also for the other panels within that column and within that row. And because I have tokens here in this template for the X and Y labels, the X and Y label also updated. So it's sort of a nice thing that that works. However, I know I tend to not want to do something like I'm trying to show you that you can do this, but of course, now I'm splitting my data into multiple places. So that's not typically a technique that we would want to use. So let me actually just completely undo this, because I want to show you another way that this can be done. And I want to show you how to do this using redirect column and then updating the data in that way. So first of all, in order to use this technique to replace this data and update everything in the graph all at once, even though I have all these different commands set up, I can update this all in just one drag of data. But to do that, I need to set up a data group that has the same column heading names that you see here within this, what's my original data set. But I'm going to use, again, a redirect column. So if you've never used a redirect column before, this is a kind of like an alias, and it's very handy. I use these a lot when I'm, I don't know, doing all sorts of different things. So first of all, to create the redirect column, go into the other drop-down menu and you'll see redirect. If you happen to not be using the most recent version of DataGraph, I think these maybe came out in 4.6. So that would be one thing. If you don't see redirect under here, you might want to update your version so you have this functionality. But anyway, so I'm going to create one redirect column, and I want my redirect columns, again, to have the same names that you see here, X1 y1, x2, y2, x3 on the x-axis and each variable on the y-axis. So when I create my y2, which again, I'm going to option drag to now make another one, my y2 will be the same data. It'll also be the month. And then I can clone both of these, and this will be x2 and y2, but this time I'll use the temperature. Now, another handy trick that I use all the time is from menu to menu to use command drag. So I'm holding the command key to drag a menu selection to another one. Now I'll highlight x2 and y2, hold down option drag, make this x3 and y3, and maybe this one will do rain. There we go. So now I have these columns, these 6 columns that have the same name as my original set of columns. And I'm going to place these all in a group, and we'll just call this whatever you want, but I'll call this redirect. And so now to make this work, there's one more thing that I need to do, and that is to take all of these commands. And actually, I will use, let me, just in case, I hate to do things like this, in case people are new and haven't seen this, I'm going to click this little, that was not a very good arrow. I'll click this swap button down here to put my commands on the left-hand side. Again, in case you've never done this before, this is a way to swap the data with your command view. So we'll do this again, just to make sure you see what I did, and that button moves with the data. So anyway, so here's all these commands that I have. Now I can see my list really well. I need to also place these all in a group. So I'll just highlight them, click the group icon that's over here in the panel. And now this is going to be we'll just call this commands. Okay. And now, hopefully I did everything right. This works like I hope it will. Now I'm going to take this data set, the group, and drag it and drop it onto this command group. And voila. So everything updated. It updated. It's nice when things work the way that I intend them to. So it updated all of my data. It also updated all of my labels. So if you want to look at this a little bit, so this bottom left, this is the month of the year. And even though this is many, many years of data, this sort of makes sense. This is the 1 to 12. This is just showing you the months. Then we can see the relationship between the month and the maximum temperature. This would be in Celsius. Then we see the relationship between the month and the amount of rain that we have. And then, some of these are repeated, but we again have this matrix of the relationships between each of these variables. So I'm glad that I'm glad that updated appropriately, because it's a very nice. Even though you look at this and say, oh, there's a lot of different panels and you're moving things around, there's all these techniques that you can use that make creating graphics like this actually pretty straightforward, as long as you sort of master how to do this. And this wasn't that hard, right? All we had to do was create a group that had the same column names as my original data, and then it just dragged and dropped it on this command group, and it updated everything. So if you ever need to confirm where anything is coming from, I can highlight this menu selection now and see that it's coming from my new redirected data. And if I want to switch back again, it's just as easy to drag the original onto here and update it. And now you'd see that this is coming from that group of data, that original set of data. And so as a result, I've used that technique to create some of these more, again, sophisticated graphics that you see here, where you now have a lot of, I have all the meteorological data from that file in this one graphic. I've also added in titles in here. I've removed the spaces in between to kind of maximize the area for the data itself. And I started with, again, this base 10 by 10 in order to create this graphic here by using that technique of just replacing the data labels. This is created in a very similar fashion, except here, I guess the one thing that's slightly different is that I also have all of the data itself in that's for a particular X and Y axis. I have both a title and a line plot, and they're in one group. Now, again, this makes it very easy for moving multiple commands to a particular location. So if I wanted to, so this is basically data. This is, again, coming from that meteorological data. This is just a subset. But if I split X again, and I wanted to move this group of commands that has both the text label and the line, if I wanted to move them to this last graph, then the group has this option of clicking on the gear menu and move to X-axis, and I could say move to axis 4. And if you have multiple X and Y axes, then it will allow you to, you can use that technique to move through, to move to the different axes. So anyway, so that's a useful technique to know. I guess the other thing that I'm doing here is I'm using a mask to define what data I'm using for the graphs. So the actual data that I'm plotting, if we just, if we looked at the plot command, then I'm pulling a particular year that's coming from this variable, and then I'm using that same variable to form the text command label. So that's kind of another handy trick for kind of keeping things coordinated within a particular group. I hope this was helpful. If you, again, yes, send us messages. And I think that's about it for now. So I hope everyone has a great weekend, and you're very welcome. And we have a rainy day today in North Carolina, but hopefully it will be nice after that. Actually, the best part of North Carolina right now is it's strawberry season. So fresh strawberries this is one of my favorite times of year here because of that. So we'll be doing strawberry picking. We did last weekend. We'll do that again, hopefully this weekend. So best to everyone, and we'll see you next time.